some weird thing they've done in their lab. It's crazy. And yet, that's what we do. We also have problems where we think that like people who are good at, say, acting would make a good governor of the state of California if we believe Arnold Schwarzenegger was good at acting. Argue with that. But where people are like, whoa, he was good at that, he made a lot of money, he must be good. He'll be a good governor, I guess. Or say, real estate development. You might be good at one thing, but it doesn't, I mean, we have data that says it doesn't transfer. We also know that experts don't just do stuff right away that won't work. They spend time to figure out what might work before they implement things like a travel ban in the chat. Okay. Almost over. But there is a lot of data out there that suggests that we're not terribly good at applying what we know about kind of problem solving to making decisions like who to elevate to positions of authority. Which segues into how we make decisions. Which is kind of the last topic for the course, is decision making. And again, like problem solving, decision making is a terribly complex problem for the task. And so, again, this is going to be at the level more of description than mechanistic, kind of exactly how does the brain do this. But it's even worse because where decision making started, the field of kind of trying to understand decision making really has its roots not in psychology but in economics. And so kind of classic decision making theory came out of econ, which makes sense because if you were an economist and you really understood why people make the decisions they make, you would be a fantastic economist. If you could predict who's going to buy what, why, what are the markets going to do, how are people going to decide what stocks to buy, you would be a fantastic economist. And there was and still is a lot of work in economics trying to understand judgment and decision. And really the roots of decision theory or decision making theory are from economics. They did most of the early work. But in that classic economical theory, their starting assumptions were that people would behave rationally, meaning they would use deductive reasoning or logic. They would come up with defensible, logical decisions. And in deciding what was logical, they would try to maximize their outcome. Which really means that they would apply probability. So like, what are the possible outcomes? How likely are they? And so, in classic decision theory, coming out of economics, is really based on math and probability and logic. Now, the problem that early decision-making theory had, well, there were some obvious problems right from the get-go, which is, if you're saying people should make decisions that maximize their outcome, that might be somewhat easy, you'd think, in economics, because your outcome would be dollars. Like, which decision is going to lead to more dollars? It's much more difficult if you're trying to understand decision-making outside of the economics realm. Like, who should I date? Where should I live? Things of that nature where it's harder to measure the outcome in concrete terms. But even in economics, although mathematically You can say, oh, it's simple. We're just going to measure maximizing outcome in terms of dollars. It didn't even work even within the economics paper. Because it turns out that a dollar doesn't equal a dollar doesn't equal a dollar. Or $1,000 doesn't always have the same value. Which is, if I'm like trying to motivate people and I'm trying to figure out how much I need to pay, $1,000 is not the same to different people. Right? If I offer you $1,000, you might be willing to do a lot. If I offer that to Bill Gates, like he cares. $1,000 doesn't mean much to Bill Gates. That is, every dollar you make has less impact on you than the previous dollar. And so the value to a human of a dollar decreases with more dollars. And so if you're using math and probability and trying to weight, like, how good is this decision versus that decision, you can't even use just dollars in a simple system, because the same dollar amount is going to have different value depending on who it's for. And again, not to get too political, but when people talk about tax reform, and they start talking about like upper tax bracket folks and whether they're paying enough or not. But then if you look at like people who are in that upper tax bracket whom we know something about their finances, you have people who they're reporting their wealth as somewhere like when Romney ran, they were like his wealth is between 150 and 180 million dollars. And that's like as close as he could get. It was a $30 million range. If you don't know whether you have $30 million or not, it's hard to argue that you'll miss a couple thousand more in your taxes because you don't even know what you have. But bottom line is like $1 million to you and I would be life changing. $1 million to a billionaire doesn't matter. So in economics, when they realized this problem, they had a solution, which is they replaced kind of value, the value of a dollar, with something called expected utility, which is more subjective, and it's how useful would this be to you, the individual. And what that got around was that $1,000 to one person might have high expected utility. It might be really useful, really helpful. But that same $1,000 to somebody else might have low expected utility. So they try to get the dollar sign out of the calculation and instead had a subjective based on psychology, based on the individuals, how useful would this be? Which was a big change, but even with that change, the classic theory still depended on applying logic and probability to determine which decisions were best. So the question becomes, to what extent are we good at logic and probability? So essentially, the question becomes, are you logical? And what economic theory has given us are normative models. And normative models are models of how you should behave. And through the application of probability and logic, we can actually create normative models. We can determine what the right decision is. of a perfect empirical world. But the question is, how do people actually compare to those normative models? Those normative models being models of how people should behave. How people should reason. And the normative theories, again, are based on the application of logic and problem. And so for this model of how we should behave to work for how we do behave, we'd have to understand logic and probability. And so the question becomes, do we understand logic and probability? Let's start with logic. So, in logic, good logic, sound logic, is deductive reasoning, which is drawing a conclusion intended to follow logically from a given set of premises or given set of generalizations. So it's essentially reasoning from the general to the specific, which is, if I know some general rules, how well can I apply them to a specific case? And that's kind of the basis of deductive reasoning. To make this a little more concrete, let me give you some kind of classic logical forms in deductive reasoning. So one kind of classic logical form that people who study logic have used a lot is a syllogism. And in a simple syllogism, you have something like two statements that are the premises, and then a third statement that's a conclusion. Where the conclusion is supposed to be a logical, deductive application of those premises. The premises are the general statements, the conclusion is the specific. And you can have different types of syllogisms, but a common one that has been studied are categorical syllogisms. And in a categorical syllogism, essentially, you describe the relationship between categories using words like all, none, or some. So it's a really stripped down version of logic. Two premises, conclusion, you're going to compare categories using things like all, none, or some. The syllogism is considered valid if the conclusion follows logically from the premise. So a valid syllogism is just, is it logical? Is the conclusion logical given the premises? And people have looked at this for a long time in logic, going back all the way to Aristotle, who Aristotle presented as perfect syllogism, where the premise one was all A are B, premise two is all B are C, and the conclusion is therefore all A are C. It's a simple categorical syllogism. The conclusion that all A are C follows logically from all A are B and all A are C. That's Aristotle for his. Okay. So how good are we at even these really simple logical well, one of the nice things about logic and the logic of these categorical syllogisms is you can actually divorce valid from true. Okay. Valid talks about whether the logic works. Does the conclusion follow from what the premises are? Truth is what is the state of the world, what is real. And so, while valid refers to whether the argument is logically